When you think about Russia, the first thing that comes to mind is probably its sheer scale. It's the largest country on Earth, and its geopolitical influence is impossible to ignore. But when you look at its economy, you see a deep contradiction. This disparity isn't an accident. It's actually the result of a foundational flaw that was set in motion decades ago, and it explains so much about the country's trajectory today. So that leads us to the central question we're looking at today. How can a nation with such vast resources, with such a formidable presence on the world stage, have an economy that, by so many objective measures, just dramatically underperforms? This paradox, it really reveals the long-term consequences of squandered potential. To put this into perspective, let's just use a simple comparison. Russia's GDP makes it the 11th largest national economy in the world. Now, on the surface, that sounds pretty significant, but it's actually smaller than the output of a single American state, Texas. The numbers themselves, well, they're less important than the story they tell, a story of just completely unrealized potential. To really understand the root of this underperformance, we have to go back in time, back to the early 1990s. The story of Russia's modern economy, it begins with the collapse of the Soviet Union and a very specific, imported blueprint that was used to try and build a market economy from its ashes. The decade after 1991 was, to put it mildly, chaotic. The world's second superpower essentially vanished, leaving this massive power vacuum. And right in the middle of all of this, a new government tried to pull off a rapid, radical transformation. They brought in a new currency, and most importantly, they began this process of privatizing huge state-owned industries. This entire turbulent period ended with a devastating financial crisis in 1998, which basically erased any progress that had been made. Now, the plan for this transformation wasn't drawn up in Moscow. It actually came from institutions like the International Monetary Fund, and it was called the Washington Consensus. You can think of it like an IKEA instruction manual for building a national economy from scratch. It was a standardized 10-step recipe for creating a capitalist system. The instructions in this manual were pretty clear. Open up to foreign trade, deregulate your markets, and establish legal security for property rights. But the most important, the most consequential step was the first one, the privatization of state enterprises. You see, in the Soviet Union, the state owned everything. This plan required selling it all off. And right there, that is where the foundational flaw was created. The problem wasn't necessarily the blueprint itself, but its execution. The entire process of privatizing the nation's industries was just fundamentally mishandled, and that single failure cemented Russia's economic trajectory for decades to come. So what did those consequences actually look like? Well, instead of being sold to the highest bidder for fair value, state assets, we're talking factories, mines, entire oil fields, were handed over to politically connected individuals, often for bribes. This meant two critical things. First, the state raised almost no money from selling its most valuable assets. And second, it created a new class of ultra-wealthy individuals, the oligarchs, who now controlled the crown jewels of the economy. These new owners often ran the industries poorly, and, crucially, they moved their new wealth out of the country, a process we call capital flight. This process didn't just create a flawed economy, it created an entirely new power structure, a system designed not for broad prosperity, but for the benefit of a very, very small group of people. And this is the part most people miss when they try to analyze Russia's decisions. What this did was create a fundamental political trade-off. You know, in a typical democracy, a leader stays in power by making sure the general voting population is doing okay. But in the system that emerged in Russia, power is maintained by appeasing that small group of oligarchs who control the economy. Suddenly, the prosperity of the masses becomes secondary to the stability of the elite. Now, if you just look at the official data, the inequality can be misleading. Russia's Gini coefficient, which is a standard measure of inequality, is 37.5. That's actually better than the United States. But this official number, well, it conceals the true picture. And the reason that official data is misleading is because it doesn't account for the massive amount of wealth held by Russian elites in offshore accounts. Studies that try to factor in this hidden money, they project a dramatically different reality, that Russia would likely rank as the single most unequal major economy in the world. This chart here really illustrates the scale of that inequality. Based on estimates that do include those offshore assets, the top 1% of Russians control nearly 60% of the entire nation's wealth. The next 9% control another 29%. This leaves the bottom 90% of the population with just 13% of the country's wealth. It is, quite literally, a system built by design for the few. Understanding this power structure is the absolute key to understanding why Russia has been so resilient to certain kinds of economic pressure. It explains the hidden logic behind the country's response to things like sanctions.
So let's think about the 2014 sanctions that followed the invasion of Crimea. The West imposed them to try and cripple the Russian economy and force a change in policy. But in practice, they had very little effect on the country's leadership. So the question is, why?
The answer really lies in who bore the cost. The sanctions did cause pain, but that pain was not felt equally. The decision makers, the political elite and the oligarchs, they were insulated. They could tap into vast foreign currency reserves to support their companies and their banks. The general population, however, they faced the real consequences: higher inflation, shortages of imported goods, a shrinking economy. The people who made the decisions were shielded from the pain they caused. And here's the crucial point. This is not a bug in the system. It's a feature. The economic structure is specifically designed to sacrifice the prosperity of the general population in order to ensure the resilience of the small group at the very top. So, with this understanding of that foundational flaw and the power structure that resulted from it, we can now make a dispassionate final assessment of the Russian economy's performance over these last 3 decades. All right, let's break down the performance. For size, it gets an 8 out of 10. It is the 11th largest economy, though that rank is likely to fall. GDP per capita, a 5. It's now lagging behind China and is way down from its peak in 2013. Growth, a 0. The economy has actually shrunk over the past decade. Stability, also a 0. The sovereign risk is simply too high. And finally, industry, a 3. There's an abundance of natural resources, but very little else. All of this gives Russia a final average score of just 3.2 out of 10. That places its overall economic performance in the same category as countries like Cyprus and El Salvador. For a nation with its potential, that score is a really stark indictment of the economic path it has taken.
So the final takeaway here is clear. An economy's real strength isn't measured by its GDP or its landmass, but by the integrity of its foundation. A system that's built on a corrupt premise, one designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many, will always fail to realize its true potential, no matter how many resources it has.